So today I'm joined by a new friend of mine, Rich Lowrie, who was actually an economic advisor to Herman Cain in his presidential campaign. It's actually one that I followed some time ago and I've gotten to know more recently. We had a conversation that intrigued me, and I've already started to adopt some of the ideas that Rich planted in my head. So Rich, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, share a bit about your background, and then let's roll up our sleeves and get right into the substance. And, I think the technical issues you talk about actually go to the heart of the American identity campaign that I'm on. And I think over the next little bit, we're going to tie up what seems like a technical subject, but which really goes to the essence of American identity itself. So that being said, tell us a little bit about you and what got you animated about these issues.
I've been in the investment business. This year would be my 35th year. And so I follow markets, the economy professionally, for that period of time. And I just got sick of yelling at the TV what these knuckleheads should do. And it started around the time that I started to have kids. And it got to a point where it's like, I need to do something to try to make a difference. If you can steer the debate in the right direction. And it is about one thing and one thing only: economic growth. The lack of economic growth since 2000 has caused every problem you could imagine. So think of stagnation as dark, damp conditions, and fungus and mold starts to grow. And we can either get rags and cleaner and spend the rest of our lives trying to fight back and clean it up, but it's going to grow faster than you can clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
What you need is robust growth, which is like the sun shining in. You get rid of the dark, damp conditions. Every problem that has been caused by a lack of growth can be solved by a return to robust, sustainable growth. But nobody is even asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you probably observe now, they're talking about, well, how much should we cut?
It's kind of bizarre, actually. Language, as we say, carves the channels through which thought flows. Growth has actually left the lexicon a little bit.
It has.
And it's sort of weird, actually. What do you think accounts for that? It is a bizarre observation you're making.
Well,
and I think it's interesting.
There are two things. I'll start with, and it's a simple analogy. Does the engine pull the train or does the caboose push it?
Okay.
And we think the caboose pushes it.
I mean, that's wrong. I mean, we don't actually think that. But,
no, we do.
Yeah.
We do. And we pour fuel in the caboose, and when it doesn't work,
I'm saying that we as a culture think that, I suppose. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. You and I in this room don't. Yeah.
When the train doesn't go faster, they say, well, it's because we didn't put enough fuel in the caboose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the answer every time. So simplest way to solve that: if I took you and dropped you on a deserted island, or anybody, my favorite would be Robert Reich.
Okay.
Drop him.
All right. Clinton, Secretary of Labor. Let's
drop him on a deserted island
All right.
and say, come on, Bob, show me how you can consume something before you produce it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think would happen? He'd stand there and say, I demand. He would get hungry and say, I demand.
He'd starve to death.
Food. He would.
Yeah.
Or he would change his mind and say, hey, you know what? So you have to engage in an act of production first. Then and only then you can consume. So the most dangerous equation in the world is taught in every textbook. It starts out by saying GDP equals consumption plus government spending plus investment plus net exports.
Mm-hmm. I learned it.
Okay.
That was 2003 freshman year.
Okay.
Economics.
That's exactly. It's in every standard textbook. So imagine looking at that equation. It creates the optical illusion. Well, hey, if consumption is the biggest part of this, we just need to spend, right? That's saying the caboose pushes a train.
Mm-hmm.
All that equation is saying, let's try to count how much GDP we produced. It doesn't say anything about how we produce it. To me, it's like the pay stub of the country.
How would you do it differently?
The way you would do it, well,
what is the metric? It's interesting because you probably have something in common with a lot of people who say that they're opposed to GDP as a measure of national success too, but they mean something very different than you do. People in the degrowth camp.
GDP is the ultimate. Real GDP growth is the be all end all. And my favorite metric is income growth for the bottom 90%, who I call the striving majority.
Okay.
In fact, you could trace income growth for the striving.
But let's go piece by piece. Though.
Okay.
So that GDP equation is the problem. Move us forward from there in terms of what you think the right metric and right equation and measurement ought to be.
It's a simple ROI, or return on asset equation.
Okay.
That the entire private sector operates on. And GDP is just a sum total of the private sector. So you take GDP minus the residential component of GDP, and you now have residential GDP and non-residential GDP.
Yep.
All right. Then you go and look at produced assets.
Would you take government spending out too?
No, what I'm trying to do is find the return on assets.
Okay, return on assets overall for the society. Okay,
so it's just residential GDP, non-residential GDP. Do the same with produced assets. Subtract out residential assets, and what's left are non-residential assets. And when you do the math, residential assets generate 7 cents of GDP per dollar of residential investment. Non-residential investment generates 45 cents of GDP. So even a liberal knows 45 is greater than 7.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. There's no better game in town. If every dollar of business investment generates 45 cents of GDP, the whole equation should be, how do we get more business investment?
Okay. What's the answer?
Well, you got to do 2 things. First, you have to answer to the striving majority why they've been left behind for 20 years, right? Because initially, it will sound like we need more business investment. That's tax cuts for corporations, right? There's no constituency to support tax cuts for corporations. So first thing you would do is address income stagnation. Why has the striving majority been left behind? And how are you going to fix it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think
let's just talk about that. Let's make that the heart of what we actually dive into. It's the most important question. What is going on with income stagnation in America?
Well, I think the Fed is.
What's the state of affairs? Let's describe it. I mean, you say that, so let's support that. Are we in a moment of income stagnation for the striving majority, the 90%?
Absolutely.
Okay.
If I had slides in a monitor, I would just pull up a slide and you could see it for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So let's go back 1946 or 7 to 1971. We had 23 years where income for the bottom 90% went up 85%.
Over what years?
23 years.
85% over 23 years. Which 23 years?
1947
late 40s. Yep,
to
late
71, 40s. Maybe 1948. And it tracked with the top 10. So if you're looking at this across the page, you have the top 10 and the bottom 90 traveling up the page together.
Mm-hmm.
1970s, so starting in 1971, where we broke the dollar, now the dollar floated. So from the founding of the country, from the time the Constitution said, Article 1, Section 8 says Congress has the ability to issue money and regulate the value thereof, where the word regulate meant to stabilize it, right? And we had that until 1971. The 70s was, if anyone wants equality, the 70s was equality. We had equality of misery. Everybody suffered. And since then, we had growth in the 80s and 90s. And from 2000, income growth for the bottom 90% has declined and never recovered. And in 2000,
you will peg a causal relationship to the floating of the dollar. The dollar's depegging from the gold standard.
It opened the door for it, right? So a dollar's a unit of measure. like the hour, the foot, the pound.
Yep.
I could put $1,000 on the table and say, Vivek, tell me who the head of the Office of Weights and Measures is. Nobody knows. And she keeps the hour at 60 minutes every day, has a perfect record of that. She keeps a foot at 12 inches. There's nobody in Washington that has a better batting average than Carol Hockert, who maintains all of our official weights and measures. We don't even think about it. Imagine if time floated. Nobody would be on time. Nothing would get done. The economy would grind to a halt. The dollar is the most important unit of measure in the world. And as it floats and it's volatile, it just causes tremendous chaos and inefficiency. That was the 70s. In the 80s under Reagan, you had guys like Manley Johnson, Paul Volcker, Jerry Jarrett, Wayne Angel, who said, okay, we no longer have an explicit mandate to tie the dollar to gold, but we just all know that the economy functions better if we keep the unit of measure stable.
Can you just bolster that argument for a second? I mean, I think it sounds persuasive on its face when you make the unit of time measurement. You're right. If time floated, we wouldn't show up on time, but that's why we would be unproductive. Right? That's the clear why, because we wouldn't show up at things that we needed to show up at to get things done. What's the missing link for why when the dollar floats, why that leads to a loss of productivity?
Okay, so use oil.
Okay.
Let's compare two periods. This period, oil averages $60 a barrel within a range of plus or minus 5 points, right? So it goes from 55 to 65 and it averages 60.
This period being?
Well, that would be the 48 to 71 period.
48 to 71, okay, fine.
82, 2000. And I'm saying 60. I'm not saying oil was 60 then, but I'm just saying you did have long periods where oil was stable.
And what was it around per barrel back then?
Oh, gosh. In the 40s, probably
$30.
Oh, no. $2-3 a barrel.
Oh, really? Okay.
And compare that to a different period of time where oil might have averaged $60, but it traded from 40 to 140, back down to 40, back up to 140, and you had this extreme volatility, but it still averaged 60, right? So what happens when prices, and you get that volatility because the unit of measure is volatile.
Which is the dollar.
Right.
It's an interesting claim.
So what happens is oil goes up.
You think oil, it's an interesting point. You think the volatility in the price of the commodity was not driven by the factors that normally are ascribed to it, like, the rise of either OPEC behavior or wars in the Middle East or a lot of other factors, but were instead actually just artifacts of instability in the dollar?
It's both. If you had a stable unit of measure, then you could look at price signals and say that's a clean price signal. Prices going up, it's indicating scarcity.
Yeah, you're saying it was confounding the ability to have a price signal of what was going on.
Exactly.
How volatile was that? Like, I guess there's measures of volatility, right? Yep. I mean, what's a good measure of volatility of a price? I mean, you could just say.
Well, I mean, every asset has its own
metric
volatility.
But how would you compare the volatility of the dollar? Like, how would you describe the volatility of the dollar? What measure would you use?
It's been extreme since 2000.
What's the measure of volatility of the dollar? What's one example of a formula that would be good for that?
I mean, you could use like covariance over a period of time.
Fine.
And I did some work that went back and said, let's find periods of sustained stability, periods of sustained volatility, where covariance was a measure. You collect up all the volatile periods, you collect up all the stable periods, and then you look at economic performance. And
for how long of history? For like
100 years.
A couple 100 years? Okay, 100 years. Okay.
Yeah, 100 years, going back to the when the Fed started.
And what you find, I assume, is that economic productivity and
exactly
growth
what you think it would be
is stagnant during periods where there's a lot of volatility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So going back to the oil. Let's say oil goes from 60 to 120.
And that was for volatility of the dollar that you're talking about there.
Yeah, and I use commodities as a real
benchmark,
a measure of something real in the economy.
Yep.
So go back to oil. Oil goes from 120 to 140. We just got done saying every dollar of business investment generates 45 cents of GDP every year. When oil's at 120, the hot money capital starts to flow into oil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you get more, and then when it goes the other way and goes back down to 40, what happens to that capital? It gets eviscerated.
Mm-hmm.
Now oil is at 40 and that project is no longer viable. So you get layoffs, you get write-offs, and that capital that got sucked away from an industry where it would otherwise generate 45 cents of GDP was just wasted.
Now, you would acknowledge that we would still have some volatility in the price of oil relating to fundamental factors in the world, but you would say we would have less volatility, and at least we would know exactly how that related to factors in the world.
I would say you would have clean price signals.
Clean pricing, yeah.
Yep.
So oil's one analogy. But again, put meat on that bone as much as you can for the connection. The correlative data is interesting and can be part of a persuasive case. But for me, what's the mental model for, other than the intuitive psychological, match here? I mean, yes, ideally we don't want things to have variable units of measure, but on the dollar specifically, how does that volatility have a causal impact on the underlying economic productivity? Because that would be very powerful if you're able to make that case. I'm hungry for that. What would you say?
Well, the more volatile the dollar, the more stagnant the growth.
That's a historical observation of correlation, though. Why was that the case, do you think?
Because it sends it causes a misallocation of capital.
Okay,
right?
Fine. Misallocation of capital.
And when you misallocate capital, returns on capital are going to go down.
Fine. That's the missing link I was looking at. Misallocation of capital based on temporary dislocations from against the backdrop of
faulty price signals.
Yep.
Right. So a price going up should indicate scarcity, but a price going up could just be the fact that the dollar is losing its value.
Fine. That's persuasive to me. That's what I was looking for.
And then, so after the 70s, the Manley Johnsons, the Wayne Angels of the world said, hey, we're kind of on our own. We don't have an explicit mandate to link the dollar with gold. We don't want to go through what they went through in the 70s. We do know that the Fed should have one job to stabilize the dollar. And if you talk to Wayne Angel, he looked at commodity prices. And it was pretty simple. I've met with Manley Johnson. And he was the one that Greenspan assigned the Fed's response to the 1987 crash to. And guess what it was? Just stabilize the dollar.
That was Greenspan's response to the...
Greenspan put Manley Johnson in charge.
In what, 80?
Of the 1987, the Fed's response to the 1987 crisis. And the response was basically just stabilize the dollar.
And it worked.
It worked. And I don't know about you, but if we had a 29% drop in one day in the market, you have any confidence that the Fed would do the right thing?
Not today, no, absolutely not. They would create some cockamamie narrative about why they needed to engage in some complex scheme of doing whatever
they would go back to the only thing they know how to do. So once these guys, and you could look at growth during the 80s and 90s, the dollar was stable. Oil prices were stable. Growth was strong. The striving majority prospered. And then I pin the turning point. So there's no explicit link to the dollar. It's discretionary, right? You have to achieve full employment, low inflation, but they had discretion. The Manley Johnsons and Wayne Angels basically said, okay, we are going to use our discretion to try to stabilize the dollar because we know that works. I pinpoint the turning point around 1997, and that's when the academics started taking over the Fed, and that's where you got the Phillips curve.
What happened? You think it was just a bureaucratic shift in the people who took over at the Fed? You think that's actually what happened? I'm just trying to understand the causal narritive of when they shifted course. That's what drove it.
They went out and got PhD academics.
Who's the they? I mean, I care about this. I'm around the country. I care about the managerial.
The president appoints them.
So Clinton appointed who in 97 that did this?
Well, it was a 1-by-1. So think about
it. Just before we get into what accounted for that shift? Like what was going on either in Clinton's brain or in the culture?
It's the managerial class that you talk about. That's exactly what it is.
It's the rise of the managerial class says, okay, now we need the technocrats to come in and run the show. It's right around the time when it started to become the in thing.
So then you start seeing a pickup in their obsession with labor markets. So forever.
That's when the Phillips curve nonsense began. 97.
And Phillips was a New Zealand economist studying British data in the 1960s.
But they just randomly latch onto his work starting in the late 90s.
Exactly. Well, it's been out there. But
and just for people who don't know, I mean, the Phillips curve, I'm just going to state it simply. It posits a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And inflation and unemployment, exactly, which creates a false trade-off between staving off inflation and actually having full employment in the economy. And then that becomes, I guess, the stated modern mandate of the Federal Reserve. I mean, that's what I was taught in school, at least, is that's one of the goals of monetary policy is to optimize for inflation and full employment.
If there's one subject that economists of every stripe would agree on is that the Fed cannot directly influence the labor market. Right? That's where they come up with this long and variable lag concept. They can't do anything to directly influence that. But starting in the 90s, in confirmation hearings, Senate confirmation hearings for Federal Reserve governors, you start to hear the lesson of the 70s is that we can never let a wage price spiral engage again. It's like, holy cow. That was their takeaway of the 70s? That it was about wages? Wages didn't start really picking up until the mid to late 70s. By then, the horse is out of the barn.
So in the confirmation hearings, they would say that we need to make sure that wages...
That's Janet Yellen's Senate confirmation hearing. That's pretty much a direct quote.
She's pressed on making sure wages don't go up?
You tell me.
Is that really?
She said the lesson of the 70s, and I have the quote somewhere. I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
The lesson of the 70s is we could never let a wage price spiral ever engage again.
My God. Who would have ever thought wages going up is a bad thing for the country?
So we've gone from, classical inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon characterized by too much money chasing too few goods, right? That's classical economics, Milton Friedman, all that stuff, to a labor market phenomenon characterized by too many people working and getting a raise. And it's like, who are these guys to say, oh, too many people got a raise this year. We're going to start, tightening down on monetary conditions. And that's, where income stagnation has happened ever since then. So it is this long...
Well, that's a pretty powerful causal account. If you have a Federal Reserve that believes that wage growth is a bad thing, it's probably not a surprise that you see less wage growth.
Absolutely. So I think the question...
How did they actually do that? By raising rates again? I mean, I guess even if she wanted to effectuate or prevent the problem, the so-called problem of wage growth, which is actually kind of offensive to my soul.
It is.
How did she actually do that?
Well,
or how did what power do they actually have to effectuate that, even if that is what they wish to be true?
I mean, think of it. The Fed has basically one lever, right? They're either going to tighten or ease financial
they call it
conditions.
different things, quantitative or easing or whatever. But one lever is either more money in the system or less money in the system.
Basically, just for a simple analogy. What really matters is what do you look at to tell you whether to push that lever or to pull it? That's what it boils down to. So,
and you're saying they look at wage growth as the leading indicator,
right?
When in fact it's lagging.
It's lagging, totally lagging. It's the latest.
Their fundamental errors.
Cycle.
They look at that as a leading indicator. That means they've got to pull back.
Right. If you talk to Manley Johnson, who wrote a book on this, by the way, he looked at the dollar from 3 different dimensions. He said, I want to look at the dollar relative to real things in the economy. That's commodities. So how is the dollar holding its value compared to something real.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at interest rates and say interest rates tell you the dollar's value today versus future dollars. And then he would look at foreign currencies, right? So here's Manley Johnson with this lever, same lever as every other central banker. But what is he looking at? He's looking at things that give him an idea, is a dollar holding its value? Is the dollar starting to do this? I need to ease and get it back down. Is it doing this? I need to tighten. What they're doing today is they're looking like way over here.
Mm-hmm.
You see how many people are working? You see the employment cost index. You see it's all labor market. And I mean, you can pull up transcripts. And going back to the late 90s, we had the tech boom. And if you just read like quarter by quarter by quarter by quarter, there were really no signs of inflation anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the tech
even all through the tech boom. That's interesting.
No, in fact, it was the opposite.
That's interesting. Yeah,
it was the opposite. You had technology was driving the cost of things down. If you looked at the type of things that a Manley Johnson would look at, you'd say, well, if anything, there are more deflationary forces than inflationary forces. Yet if you read the Fed transcripts, they're like, oh my God, if this wage growth continues at this pace, it's going to take the economy down. So what do? They took the economy down. It's crazy. And then we wonder, why do we have income stagnation? So how are we ever going to end income stagnation?
Yes.
If the thing that ends it is across the board wage growth, which is the same thing the Fed is committed to.
Because it triggers the Fed to act.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a permanent antibody.
Exactly.
That will shut down as soon as you have the surge of the thing you want.
Exactly.
You get a Federal Reserve that shuts it down.
And if you track, whenever you get tax cuts, if you get the right kind of tax cuts on production, you get a boost of economic growth. And then as soon as growth starts to lift wages, the Fed acts to tighten it down.
So the basic thesis here, because it's complicated stuff for a lot of people, it's complicated stuff for me, but the basic thesis is, in order to unleash the power of the American economy, we need to first stabilize the unit of measurement, which is the dollar. And first is, you have historical data that will tell you that in periods where we've done that well, the economy has prospered. In periods we haven't done well, the economy hasn't. But further, that this is predictable because you would have misallocation of capital under conditions of variability. But second, even worse than not even the failure, that's just the product of failing to do the job of preserving stability. When the Fed takes on a new mission, so it's not even its abandonment of the first mission, but taking on a new mission instead, every time you do enter a period of at least wage growth, you actually have a system that's designed to go back to suppressing it. Well, we sort of putting a wet blanket on that wage growth.
Well,
by raising rates.
If they had a requirement to stabilize the dollar, they would just, wage growth would happen and they would do nothing about it.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm giving a historical account.
Yes.
Is like, so I'm just kind of trying to draw a straight line through this, right? First ingredient to economic unleashing, right? I should say economic prosperity, unleashing the American economy, stabilize the unit of measurement. The data suggests historically the times we've done that, we've been at our best. The times we haven't, we've been at our worst.
Absolutely.
That makes sense because you would expect misallocation of capital, and proper allocation of capital is indeed, to the highest earning projects, is the source of lasting economic prosperity.
Yep.
And so you have a Federal Reserve that today has abandoned doing a job that they once did well, and that accounts for a lot of the economic travails that we've since experienced. But it's one step worse than that, which is it's not only that they're failing to do the job of preserving a stable currency, but they've further expanded to include a central mission that is hostile to wage growth even when it does occur. Even under those suboptimal conditions of dollar instability, we will still get some good tailwinds.
That's right.
Of wage growth, which it's like a game of whack-a-mole. They whack it down.
That's right.
with tightening monetary policy precisely when you get income, when you get rises in income. And so it's not only that we have economic growth. We've created a self-inflicted obstacle to economic growth through the misallocation of capital story, but we've also created the condition for the striving majority to ever be striving but never be rewarded for it. Because anytime they begin to do well, the Federal Reserve puts a wet blanket on.
Merit without the reward.
It's merit. I love that. Merit without the reward.
The longer that goes on, the more they wonder, hey, this free market stuff.
And that's where they become skeptical of the story, because
it's not working for me.
Because it was rigged against them.
It was, right? And if that goes on for 20 years, that dark, damp stagnation, fungus grows. And I think that's what, woke feeds on.
I'm Vivek Ramaswamy, candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Vivek 2024.